Good afternoon. I'm Jim Pellegrino from the University of Illinois at Chicago, and I'm very pleased to be with you this afternoon to be able to speak with you today at your symposium. I thank you for inviting me, and I am hopeful that what I present to you will be of interest and be helpful in your discussions today. As you can see, the title of my presentation today is called The Assessment Triangle, a conceptual guide for development and implementation of technology-supported assessment systems. Just a few words about who I am and what I do. I am a learning scientist who focuses on STEM education, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. The bulk of my work is in that field, and over the years, I worked on a variety of reports from the National Research Council of the United States and with other bodies. These are examples of some of them. The reports focus on issues of cognition, teaching, learning, assessment, and other topics, where the goal has been to compile some of the knowledge that we have in each of these areas. And I and many others have tried to make use of this body of knowledge to try to improve many aspects of the US education system. And I know others in countries across the globe have also drawn upon these reports and this body of work. Today, what I want to discuss with you are some ways to think about assessment systems. And I'm going to be drawing on things that we first wrote about in the report, Knowing What Students Know, the Science and Design of Educational Assessment. There are really three parts to my presentation today. The first, I will talk about the issue of what is educational assessment and why is it challenging to do it well. The second is really to talk about the notion of an assessment system. What is an assessment system and what do we need to think about in designing one so that it functions well? And the last is the roles of information and communication technology in the design and use of educational assessments and assessment systems. So let's start with part one, which asks the question, what is educational assessment and why is it challenging to do it well? I often get asked this question, what is educational assessment? Why do we need it? So if we think about this at a general level, assessment of any type can be conceived as a process of gathering information for the purpose of making judgments about a current state of affairs. We assess the state of the economy, we assess water and air quality, we assess a variety of things that are important to us for the purposes of gathering information about a state of affairs. Is air quality getting better? Is it getting worse? And potentially then with that information, we can try to intervene and do something about it. Well, in educational assessment, the information that we collect is really designed to help various individuals in the education system, including teachers, administrators, policymakers, and the public, gather information or infer what it is that our students know and how well they know it. And the idea of collecting this information or gathering this information is for the purpose ostensibly of enhancing future outcomes. If we know what's happening, we can do things and act on that information to make things better in the future. Now, some of the outcomes we're interested in with respect to education are far more immediate, such as the use of assessment in the classroom by a teacher to improve student learning, to gauge how their students are doing and then act accordingly to move student learning along. But others are more delayed and they're more distal, farther away from the classroom, such as the use of assessment for program evaluation. We need to think about assessment in terms of where it fits in the broader educational system. And here I've depicted the relationship among three things that are really important in education. One is curriculum, the second is instruction, and the third is assessment. By curriculum, what I mean is essentially the content standards that have been established of what it is we want students to learn in a certain area. For example, what is it we want them to learn in mathematics or science or in language competency? That sets the basis for then instruction, which is instruction for me is what it is that teachers and students do using a variety of resources, including curricular materials and other activities to help students master that content, master that knowledge base. And assessment, the third element here, is essentially what we do to gather information about the progress of student learning. Are students progressing in the ways we intended? Now, these three things, curriculum, assessment, and instruction, need to be aligned with each other. They need to be coherent and consistent so that the system doesn't get out of balance. And assessment can oftentimes create an out of balance situation because the assessment doesn't measure or cover all of the things we want students to know. And therefore what happens is that instruction can get skewed in the direction of that which we assess. Of course, all of these things would be considerably more coherent if they all emanated from an underlying and agreed upon conceptualization coming from theory and research about what it is, about the nature of knowing and learning. What does it mean to know and learn mathematics over the course of elementary or middle school? What does it mean to know algebra and other subject matter areas? And how is that information learned with respect to conditions of instruction? So assessment is an integral part of the system, and it serves a variety of functions and purposes. Here I've listed the fact that educational assessment typically occurs in multiple contexts. At the small scale, we're talking about individual classrooms. At an intermediate scale, we could be talking about school districts or prefectures. And at the large scale, we could be talking about units which are larger, such as states, or we can talk about national assessments or even international assessments, such as things like PISA. But within and across these different contexts where assessment appears and is used, it can actually be used to accomplish differing purposes. One purpose is what we call the purpose of assisting learning, the so-called formative use of assessment. Another is to measure individual or group achievement, the so-called summative use of assessment. And a third is to evaluate programs, often used for purposes of monitoring at a large scale level and for accountability in systems to see whether or not our investments in educational systems are paying off in terms of essentially changes in the nature and the accomplishments of students and teachers in schools. But oftentimes it's the case that individuals are not happy with the assessments that we have. And it's a reflection of the fact that assessment of student learning is really a challenge. And one question is, why is assessment such a challenge? Why is it often controversial? And the answer can really be found in one fundamental premise. You can never really know what a student knows. We can't look inside students' heads. We can't directly measure the nature of their knowledge and competence. So what assessment is always a process of reasoning from evidence. The nature and the quality of the reasoning that we can do depends on the nature and quality of the evidence. So in the Knowing What Students Know report, we made an emphasis on what we call the assessment triangle to capture the idea that assessment rests on three interconnected elements. The first of which is cognition. What we mean by cognition are existing theories, models, and data about how students represent knowledge and develop competence in a given domain of instruction and learning, whether it be mathematics or science or history or whatever is the domain. This is basically, what does the research base, what does the knowledge base tell us about what it means to know and learn particular subject matter competence. Observations then are the tasks or situations that allow us to observe students' performance. Because after all, what an assessment is it's composed of tasks or situations that yield observations. It's those observations that in some ways give us a window on what it is that students know. And the nature of those observations has to emanate from the underlying cognition, that is the theory and research on the nature of what it means to know. That helps us think about the tasks. And then, of course, the third piece is we have to make sense of the data that we're getting from those observations. So these three elements, cognition, observation, and interpretation, are linked with each other. And they have to be coordinated in order to build a quality assessment. But to build that assessment and have it be meaningful and useful in the education system, we have to start with the underlying cognition vertex. That is, what is our conception of what it means to know and learn something in a domain of instruction? And so I want to just say a few words about why models of the development of domain knowledge are so critical. And I've already alluded to this in what I've said. Fundamentally, they tell us what are the most important aspects of knowledge that we should be assessing. What's really important in the domain of instruction and learning? Is it factual knowledge? Is it procedural knowledge? Is it conceptual understanding? Is it the ability to apply that kind of knowledge? How we conceptualize that is critically important, because that then gives us clues as to how that knowledge can and should be assessed. What kinds of tasks or situations should we put in front of our students that will help them express the nature of the knowledge that we're interested in? And of course, by doing it in this way, we can end up with assessments that yield more instructionally useful information. And those in turn, and this entire process, can guide the development of what we call coherent systems of assessments. It's useful to take a little simple example to illustrate perhaps some of the contrast when you frame things in terms of this assessment triangle. So let's take a case where, with respect to cognition, what we're interested in is students' knowledge of European history, and in particular, in the context of European history, the importance of sea power. So what if we had a question, and that is an observation, where we asked students, what was the date of the Battle of the Spanish Armada? So here we have two candidate students. First student answers 1588, and the second student says, well, I'm not sure, but it must have been in the late 1500s. Now, under one model of interpretation and one model of what it means to know, student A is definitely correct. That is factually the right date. Student B is incorrect under that model of interpretation, or you might say partially correct. They've at least got it in the latter part of the 1500s. And so you could sort of say, well, in this case, who gets the higher grade and why? And obviously, it would be student A. But let's reframe this a little. Let's look at a slightly different way to think about this. It's the same knowledge of European history and the importance of sea power that we're interested. That's the cognition piece. And here, the question or the observation is with respect to what was the Battle of Spanish Armada, when was the Battle of Spanish Armada, and why is that important? So here we have the same student whose answer is 1588, but the rest of the answer is, I don't know why it was important, I just memorized the date. The second student, again, student B, says, well, it must have been in the late 1500s because the English began to settle in Virginia just after 1600, although I'm not sure of the exact date. The important thing is England needed naval supremacy to start overseas explorations, but they couldn't if Spain still had control of the seas. It would take a little time to get exploration to organized, so the battle couldn't have been too late in the 1500s. Now, in giving this answer, this student demonstrates a much deeper understanding about European history and the role of sea power and how that impacted a number of things, and the role of the Spanish Armada with respect to England gaining dominance at sea, which allows them to engage in extensive colonization, including to the New World. So this just illustrates one of the many examples we could come up with to point out that the nature of the three elements of the assessment triangle is extremely important in terms of the kinds of assessments we develop and their utility with respect to improving teaching and learning in the educational system. So there's a lot more we could say in this first part, but let's just consider a couple of takeaway points from this first part. First of all, one important piece is that assessment is not a simple matter, and it's not just one thing. Assessment takes multiple forms, and it serves multiple purposes. Assessment also needs to be part of an integrated system of curriculum instruction and assessment. That is, assessment doesn't stand apart from curriculum and instruction. It needs to be integrated with it. It turns out that designing really good informative assessment is a very challenging thing to do. And in order to do this, we need a very solid conceptual foundation of what it is that students should know and how they should know it, because that is the place from which we start the whole assessment development and interpretation enterprise. And so the other thing is we need to be very thoughtful about how we pose problems or questions to students and what expectations we have about the meaning and value of the responses. It turns out that if evidence is basically a process of reasoning from evidence, we have to be very careful about the nature of the evidence that we're going to get based upon the kinds of questions or problems we pose to students. So let me turn to the second part now, which is about an assessment system and why we need to think carefully about designing one. Often people sort of say, well, why can't we just use one kind of a test? Why do we need an assessment system? And the answer is really rather straightforward. We need a system that's composed of different forms and types of assessment because fundamentally, one size does not fit all. And one way to think about this is that we have educators at different levels of the system, and they need different information, and they need it at very different time scales for use. This is another way of saying they have differing priorities, they operate under different constraints, and there are trade-offs in terms of time, money, and the type of information needed. What a teacher needs in the classroom is different than what an administrator needs at a higher level at the district or state or national level. So therefore, we need to think about having coherent assessment systems. And it's interesting to try to figure out, well, how do we define an assessment system? One way to start trying to define it is to sort of define what it's not. And this quote from Coladarchi is one of my favorite ones with respect to the whole issue of assessment systems. Basically, he said that a collection of assessments does not entail a system any more than a pile of bricks constitute a house. It's another way of saying that a system has to be designed. It must be composed of elements that have been designed to work together in terms of the intended functions and interpretive uses. So what are some important system design properties and principles? Well, these are three that we've written about and talked about in other forms: coherence, comprehensiveness, and continuity. What do we mean by coherence? It means that the conceptual model of student knowing and learning that underlies the various assessments within the system are compatible. The conceptual base for a high-level state or district-level assessment is simply a broader version of the one that makes sense at the finer-grained classroom level. By comprehensiveness, we mean that a range of measurement approaches are used to provide a variety of evidence to support educational decision-making. No single assessment should ever be a definitive indicator of what a student knows. And continuity, it means that the system measures student progress over time. using multiple sets of observations over time that are conceptually linked so we can observe change and interpret the nature of that change over time and with instruction. And this means that models of student progress and learning should underlie the entire assessment system. So here's a little example, an illustration of what a multi-level system might look like. It reflects sort of an idyllic situation. Oftentimes we sort of see in the United States that we have assessment at 3 levels. We have assessment at the base of this pyramid at the classroom level. A classroom assessment is far more extensive than assessment that occurs at the next level up, which is the district level. And at the top of the pyramid is what we have at the state or maybe national level. Now, notice that in this representation, we have certain sets of things that we've identified as properties of this multi-level system. There are targeted goals for student learning, there are quality tools, and there are quality uses of that information, which more or less align with the 3 elements of the assessment triangle: the cognition, observation, and interpretation vertices. What makes something an integrated system? It's coordinated across the levels and purposes. Each level is designed to fulfill its own intended purpose. It's unified by common learning goals derived from learning theory, research, and content. Again, the cognition piece. And it's synchronized by unifying progress variables that map out expected trajectories of learning. So how should the different assessments in the system be organized? Well, typically what we want is a multi-level system. Each level fulfills a set of functions, and it has a clear set of intended users of the assessment information. And then the tools are designed to serve the intended purposes. In other words, design is optimized for the function served. The levels are articulated and conceptually coherent. They share the same underlying concept of what the targets of learning are at a given grade level and what the evidence of attainment should be. And importantly, they provide information at a grain size and on the time scale appropriate for translation into action at each of the levels of the system. So let me wrap up and turn to part 3, which is what are the roles for information and communication technology in the design and execution of assessment systems. We can start this conversation by just talking about the limitations of many current assessments, whether they involve ICT or not. One of the limitations of many assessments that we use in the education system is they tend to emphasize disconnected declarative knowledge of bits and pieces of factual knowledge. They neglect integrated schematic knowledge structures in areas of math, science, history, and other subject matter areas, which we know are very important from research on the nature of knowing and learning. They tend to emphasize procedural algorithms and skills, and they neglect strategic thinking skills, and they provide limited work with in solving authentic problems. Now, technology has a lot of opportunities and affordances to facilitate assessment design and use, particularly with respect to all 3 vertices of the assessment triangle. So here I've listed a few. Technology allows us to tap a broader repertoire of cognitive skills and knowledge. It allows us to go beyond conventional practices for item presentation, as often dictated by pencil and paper tests. It allows us to implement a range of different kinds of task designs and item formats. It allows us to record and score complex aspects of behavior, including the strategies and actions that students take in solving problems. And it also correspondingly allows us to analyze complex aspects of student performance that we can't simply get out of very simple selected response type problems. It also allows us to embed assessment in learning environments and helps us thereby connect assessment with curriculum and instruction in an ongoing basis. Now, there's lots of advantages for technology use in areas of science and math assessment. I've listed several of them here. And in essence, what technology allows us to do is to present authentic, richer, dynamic environments where students can do a variety of things like things that they would be impossible to observe and manipulate otherwise, including simulations, modeling, causal relations. It allows us to present much more interesting stimuli, including multimedia stimuli and interactive stimuli. It allows students to manipulate stimuli as part of investigations. And it allows students to better control pacing and things like that. And as I said, it allows us to capture student responses when doing various kinds of tasks, such as research, design, and problem solving. And it allows us to sort of use a variety of tools that come from the internet, not just productivity, but things like that are domain-based, including tools in the domain of mathematics and science. Here's an example of a task just to illustrate a little bit of what's possible. This is a science task that's intended for middle school students. It depicts an ecosystem, a lake ecosystem, and it allows the student to select from options in terms of elements of that ecosystem to represent what would happen in this ecosystem in terms of how essentially the power plant could impact that ecosystem in terms of how the elements of that system interact, and determine not just who is impacted, but what is the direction of that impact in terms of whether it produces positive or negative changes. So there's many different examples of tasks like this, simple and complex, that technology allows us to implement and to create much more interesting, engaging, and informative assessments. Now, when it comes to assessment system design in ICT, what we want to say is that the system should use tasks and tools and technologies that are really appropriate to the desired inferences we want to make. We don't force everything into a fixed testing or a task model or a certain kind of technological application. Rather, we have a range of tasks that can be designed using technology, including performances and portfolios and projects and fixed and open response tasks. And the other thing is that it provides information at a grain size and on the time scale that's appropriate for translation into action by the different users of the information at the different levels of the system. We always have to think about what do teachers need, what do administrators need, what do policymakers. So one of the rules of thumb I would say is the use of ICT should be considered in terms of not just adding efficiency, but also value. What is the return on investment with respect to the needs of users of assessment and assessment results? So there are weaker and stronger uses of ICT in assessment. Weaker uses are ones where there's really no substantive change in what is assessed or how it's assessed and how the information is used. So it tends to be cases where we're just using the technology to largely do things that we already do with paper and pencil testing formats. So at a general level, it has to do with administration. Maybe it can be cheaper. Maybe we can produce shorter tests by using adaptive methods. The content usually hasn't changed very much, although we may be able to do some things with students who have disabilities in terms of accommodating their needs better through technology. And scoring is just generally quicker. There's a quicker turnaround, but we haven't fundamentally changed the nature of what we're assessing or how we're assessing it. Much stronger uses of ICT in assessment system involve substantive changes in what is assessed, how it's assessed, and how the information is used. This includes being able to support much more formative uses of assessment, including diagnostic assessment and providing feedback and coaching. It allows us, as I said before, to use multiple aspects of media, including animations, video, and simulations things that are truly impossible in a static paper and pencil world. It allows for sophisticated analysis and scoring, including more sophisticated skills like inquiry. It allows us to bring into the assessment scoring and analysis natural language processing and AI processing. And in reporting, not only does it allow us to turn things around faster, it can provide more detailed reporting, but also it can provide reports that are meant to support teachers in classroom, which are much closer to trying to generate information that supports instruction. So I want to offer just a couple of concluding thoughts about how thinking in terms of the assessment triangle can serve as a conceptual guide for the development and implementation of technology-supported assessment systems. I really believe there's a better future for the development and implementation of technology-supported assessment systems if we think in terms of the assessment triangle logic. That is, this whole idea of reasoning from evidence, and that idea should guide the design of all the assessments in the system. Then the assessment system components have to be designed in collaboration with practitioners, students, researchers, developers, and policymakers, taking into account their respective needs. You need to use the diverse expertise of all of these constituents and stakeholders. And that expertise needs to include multiple disciplines, such as the cognitive and learning sciences, content experts, measurement scientists, and the computational science. And the system should be designed to be coherent across multiple levels, from classrooms through schools to boards of education to the government level. So I have some final comments for various stakeholders in the audience today. To those of you who are practitioners, the use of technology isn't just about reductions in workloads for things like grading. You should focus more on how technology and better assessment design can get you more instructionally valuable information to support your ability to implement a very powerful formative assessment process as part of your ongoing teaching and learning. To those of you who are ed tech developers, I would say the use of technology isn't just about faster or cheaper tests or scoring. You too need to focus on how technology and better assessment design can get teachers and other educators more instructionally valuable information in a time-sensitive way. And to those of you who are educational policymakers, I would say that the use of technology, again, isn't just about cheaper tests and or faster scoring and reporting. You need to focus on how technology and better assessment design can get everyone in the system more valid information that they can use to improve the education system. So as a policymaker, you need to support the intelligent use of technology to support the system. So I thank you for the opportunity to talk with you today. I hope the rest of your meetings go well. I hope in some future day and time, which isn't where we're faced with a world with COVID-19, that we get to collaborate with each other. And I hope that what I presented to you today offers some effective food for thought as you continue your deliberations. Thank you again for inviting me.